In this next section, we're going to do a quick review of economic terms and concepts. So first, to start out, the economics of business. When we talk about this in this course, it's going to refer to the key factors that are going to affect the firm's ability to earn a rate of return on its owner's investment. So the most important of these factors are going to be competition, technology, and customers. Things we talk about in a basic economics course, we're going to talk about again in this course, but it's going to be through the lens of how to operate a business, how a business can succeed, rather than just studying in general how markets function. So it's going to be more applied and it's going to be more useful for you, hopefully. So we divide economics into two broad fields. The first of those is microeconomics. That's a study of individual consumers and producers in specific markets. So we're zeroing in on specific areas and trying to answer specific questions. So these are things like supply and demand within a market, pricing of the output of goods, whatever a firm is producing, what is the actual production process, studying the cost structure, which is incredibly boring, but we will have to go into at least somewhat in this course, and the distribution of income. The other area we split economics into is macroeconomics. So it's a study of the aggregate economy, what's going on in, say, the United States as a whole, or the global economy as a whole. It is a lot less specific than microeconomics. As one of my professors used to call it, it's all hand waving. So we're talking about national output, so like GDP, the overall unemployment rate for the country, the inflation rate, fiscal and monetary policy. So what's the Federal Reserve doing? What's Congress doing? And trade and finance between nations. So again, these are much more broad. We're going to be talking a lot less about macroeconomics in this class and focusing primarily on microeconomics. Now let's start with two of the most fundamental terms of economics. The first is scarcity. We mentioned scarcity already. Scarcity can be defined as the condition in which resources are not available to satisfy all the needs and wants of a specific group of people. Scarcity naturally exists because the wants and needs of human beings exceeds our resources. And because of scarcity, we're forced to make choices. We have to decide how we best want to combine resources to satisfy our wants and needs. Now, scarcity is different than poverty. Poverty is defined as a certain line of living standards. Anyone below that is considered in poverty. Anyone above that is considered outside of poverty. Poverty can be eradicated because it's a line that we choose to draw, but scarcity will always be with us. Now, because of scarcity, we need to figure out some way to ration goods, and we're going to talk about that later. But what also results from scarcity is opportunity cost. Opportunity cost is the amount or the subjective value that must be sacrificed in choosing one activity over the next best alternative. Now, every single activity has a cost, not just a monetary cost, but something else that you have to give up. So if I go out to eat dinner tonight, go to a restaurant and pay for that, I also can't go to a movie at the same time and pay for that. So as a consumer, I have a choice I need to make. And because I'm making, let's say I choose to go out to dinner, I don't have the time and the money to go to the movie. The subjective value of that dinner is the movie that I'm giving up. So when economists say that value is subjective, it's not because we're some kind of philosopher forcing students to prove that a desk in the classroom actually exists. The reason we do is because the value of a good or service is determined by the opportunity cost. Each individual has their own wants and needs, so they're weighing purchasing your product against all these other different products, and they're all going to value it differently. Now, another example of opportunity cost your textbook uses is the classic guns versus butter. Now, this is pretty outdated. It's an example from like the 50s and 60s. But it was a question of, should an economy focus on producing armaments, so they're able to defend themselves, or should they focus on consumer goods? Again, there's an implicit idea of a trade-off there, that they can't specialize and produce all their needs in both. So should they focus on one and trade with another country, or should they focus on the other? Now, figure 1.2 here illustrates the nature of scarcity. Basically, we have all these things, resources on the left-hand side, the supply. So we have land, labor, capital, entrepreneurship, and management skills. We can combine all these resources in a way to meet the needs and wants of the population. Unfortunately, we're never going to be able to do that. Human wants and needs seem impossible to completely satisfy. What once was considered a luxury is now considered something that people need to have. If you look at old episodes of The Simpsons, having cable TV was, too, too much for them to afford. It was too much of a luxury for a common middle class family. And a lot of Homer's friends didn't even have cable. Moving forward, through like the mid 2000s, having cable was a necessity. Everyone had cable then. It wasn't that big of a deal. Although now I don't have cable, a lot of people are just using streaming instead of cable. So we've even moved past it. But this offers us as business owners a really good opportunity. If we can combine resources in a more efficient way, so offering the previous goods at lower prices, or finding ways to create new goods that haven't been offered, that meet people's wants and needs in a better way, we can earn profit for ourselves and our company can succeed. So there's this entrepreneurial opportunity to meet people's wants and needs that aren't currently being met. Although the existence of scarcity gives us an opportunity to, earn a fantastic profit, and if we're even good enough, get ourselves as business owners on the cover of something like Forbes magazine, there's also the chance of failure. So we have to ask ourselves 3 specific questions. We have 3 choices before us to try to figure out what is the best way to succeed. So the first is, what should be produced? What product are we going to do? So it's like the guns versus butter debate from the 50s and 60s. What should we actually focus on producing? The second is, how should it be produced? So what method of manufacturing are we going to use? And this, again, is more management than economics. So should we use the assembly line? Should we use batch production? Should we use the techniques that Toyota pioneered? Should we use just-in-time management, or should we keep, an extra surplus of supplies on hand in case, there's issues with supply chains? And finally, for whom should it be produced? Who is our target market? And to answer those questions of what, how, and for whom to produce, we tend to use 3 different types of processes. The first, which is most common in the United States and in most of the Western world, is the market process. So it's relying on the idea of supply and demand. Firms are free to try to determine what they want to produce and to figure out the best way to produce those goods and to target their own specific markets. And they rely on profit and on incentives in order to determine what to produce and to provide feedback whether they're meeting consumers' needs or not. Another method is the command and control process. So the government or some central authority, central planning board determines what's going to be produced, by whom, and for whom, and how it's going to be done. So think of like the old Soviet Union. Firms are not left free to experiment. You don't have entrepreneurship like you do in a market. Your textbook leaves it out, but there's also what they call like the middle way or the third path, which is the combination of the market process and command and control. So you have some heavy government regulations. You might have them actually owning some specific industries, but they still rely on supply and demand. There's still avenues for entrepreneurship, some private ownership of businesses. So they rely on both central planning and the market process. And most countries, even the United States and the Western world, are somewhere between pure command and control economies and the market economy, because even in the United States, which we consider a free market, there's quite a bit of regulation specifying how things are to be produced. And there's some control, especially like, local utilities where the government provides these services. And then finally, there's traditional process. So they use customs and traditions in order to determine what's going to be produced and by whom. While these 3 questions are fairly similar from the standpoint of a country and from the standpoint of a company, there's going to be some slight differences. So instead of what goods and services should be produced, so thinking of the guns versus butter debate, from the standpoint of a company, it's a production decision. It's what should we as a firm be producing? What markets should we be competing in? And what products should we actually be making? The second, how should these goods and services be produced, is more specifically for a company, the hiring, staffing, procurement, capital budgeting decisions, and even management decisions of how should the factory floor be laid out, how should we organize the shelves in the supermarket, all those sorts of questions. And finally, for whom should these goods and services be produced? So how should goods and services be rationed throughout the economy? From the standpoint of a company, we're looking at the market segmentation decision. So what specific market are we competing in? Who do we think our customer base is? Now, entrepreneurship tends to be associated with the ownership of the means of production or the ownership of the company itself. But it also is the willingness to take certain risks in the pursuit of business goals. So for instance, that could be producing a new product or providing a completely different type of service. It could be using a completely different means of manufacturing and different manufacturing style or management style. Basically, entrepreneurs see some failure in the market, somewhere that no one is providing a certain product or service that meets individuals' needs. What they do is they go out and actually put this into practice. They say, hey, I recognize this specific shortcoming, and they go create a product and offer it in order to meet those needs. Management in and of itself is slightly different. Management is the ability to organize and administer various tasks in pursuit of certain objectives, in our case, business objectives. So an important part of managers' jobs is going to be, monitoring the workers that are under them and guiding people in organization to producing what needs to be produced, doing it the right way, and making sure they're staying on top of their tasks and meeting deadlines. As a business leader, hopefully, in part because of this degree that you're earning at St. Francis, you're going to be doing both of these things. You'll be an entrepreneur, you'll be figuring out new products to offer, new ways to run the business, but you'll also be a manager, the day-to-day overseeing of the business, making sure deadlines are met, making sure the product gets produced at the lowest possible cost and gets out of the door on time. So let's briefly summarize what we talked about in this chapter. First, managerial economics, the course itself. This is going to be a discipline that combines microeconomic theory with management practice. So we're taking, again, like lofty economic theory, and we're going to apply it to actually running a business. Now, the lectures are going to be a lot more theoretical, a lot more focusing on the economic side, although I will be throwing in a lot more examples than I would in a typical economics course. But a lot of the assignments are going to be having you taking these theoretical ideas and applying them to actual business situations. An important function of a manager of a firm is to decide how to allocate a firm's scarce resources. Now, in the overall economy, the United States and in the Western world, like I said, we use the market system. We use supply and demand to figure that out. We use prices and profits to determine how to do this. But within a firm, the CEO, the leader of the company, is their own central planner. They're deciding what to do. Now, finally, the application of economic theory and economic concepts helps managers to make allocation decisions that are in the best interests of the firm. So how can the firm profit the best? Many times you'll be applying the things you learn in these economics courses, these more theoretical concepts, to your problems to help you diagnose what the problem is and think of ways to solve and overcome those problems and succeed in the market.